Hello, everyone. This is Rob Pike back again with part 4 of the series, The Last Days. This is a continuing series, so if you need to get caught up, there is a link to the entire playlist in the notes below. So now, Julie, as we begin this episode, I just want to remind the audience of something that we said in our last episode. I won't post this quote this time, but Professor Berkeley Mickelson gave us the basic objective of anyone who wants to render an accurate interpretation of a Bible passage. He stated that the job of the interpreter is to make an interpretation based on what the writer wanted the hearers to hear and understand, and thereby to draw application for the modern readers. So, with this precept in mind, as we continue with the Olivet Discourse, we have to remember that in order to understand the prophecies of the aforementioned books, or for that matter, any prophecy or any passage of Scripture, we need to understand three things. When was it written? To whom was it written? And what was the purpose for writing it? So within this in mind, Julie, is there anything else that you think we should mention before we begin?
Well, those are great points, Rob. You remember last week, I think that point 2 from that list that you just shared, it can be applied there because there's an important detail in that passage which shows to whom it was written. So let's read that one again. Mark 13, 16 through 17. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. As we noted last week, the Jewish historian Josephus documented in detail the fact that when Jerusalem was under siege from the Roman armies, mothers of infants trapped inside Jerusalem were so desperate that they cooked and ate their own children. Jesus expressed concern for them in advance. It's no wonder he had told his followers to flee out of the city and head for the hills. So as we continue reading from Mark 13, let's remember that what Jesus was saying had to be for those Christian believers to whom he was speaking, because he said in verse 14, but when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Rob, logically speaking, if this was meant for our generation, would we be required to move to Judea just so we could flee to the mountains? I mean, that's just silly to apply this to any other generation than the one Jesus was speaking to. But Rob, this passage mentions something called the abomination of desolation, and we talked about looking into that further last week. So I think we need to clarify what that is, don't you?
Yeah, I think we do too. And the thing called the abomination of desolation was predicted by the prophet Daniel several centuries earlier. But I don't want to go into that prophecy at this time because it would derail our discussion here. We do have an entire series which highlights Daniel's prophecy and other Old Testament prophets, and you can find it on my YouTube channel. I've included a link to the channel in the notes below. But this abomination of desolation actually relates to what Jesus told the people in Jerusalem. Let's look at this verse here. It says, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often I would have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. So now I want you to highlight that last sentence that Jesus said. So when Jesus made that statement, he was predicting that the temple would be desolated in that passage. And this sign called the abomination would be the key event to watch concerning this, Julie. And this abomination of desolation is a multifaceted sign which involved the Roman armies, isn't it, Julie?
Yeah. 18th century commentator Albert Barnes even spoke about that. This is actually a Hebrew expression meaning an abominable or hateful destroyer. The Gentiles were all held in abomination by the Jews, if you reference Acts 10:28. The abomination of desolation refers to the Roman army. And that's explained in Luke 21:20, where he wrote, "But when we see Jerusalem, or when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near." The Roman army is further called the abomination on account of the images of the emperor and the eagles carried in front of the legions. They were regarded by the Romans with divine honors. And Rob, we also know that they were called an abomination because the Jewish historian Josephus, once again, we mention him, he said that the Roman armies eventually brought their ensigns into the temple and placed them over the eastern gate and actually made sacrifices to them there, which, as you can imagine, was a totally disgusting act to the Jews. But prior to all of that, they had surrounded Jerusalem with the intent to put the city under siege. But there was a pause, a break in that activity. Before they were able to enter the city, there was a problem that had to be addressed. Do you remember what that was, Rob?
Yeah, and this is also is addressed by Josephus when he talks about this in the Wars of the Jews. He tells us that there were two sieges of Jerusalem. The first siege was under General Vespasian, and under this siege, no one was allowed out of the city. But soon after the start of the siege, Emperor Nero died. And this meant that the Roman Empire was now in a fight over who would be the new emperor. So, as you can imagine, Vespasian withdrew his forces so that he could go back to Rome and address this problem. In fact, history records that this was so unsettling to the empire that during that very year, there were 4 different emperors in power, with Vespasian eventually winning out. So after this, and putting the Roman Empire back on solid footing, Vespasian sent his son Titus in to finish the job he started in Jerusalem. And it was during this withdrawal period that we spoke of that the Christians had the opportunity to flee to the mountains. And we must ask the question here, since this is so specific, how could it possibly fit in any other time frame, just like you said earlier?
Yeah, that's amazing. So a way was provided for those with ears to hear. And you know, the historian Eusebius of Caesarea also made it clear that as a result of obeying Jesus's command to flee, not a single Christian died in that siege.
Right.
So let's keep this in mind when we read verses 18 through 20, because what you just shared there, Rob, proves that Jesus was speaking of a local event and what was about to happen during the Roman siege of Jerusalem in 66 to 70 AD. That was when the most horrific things in the history of the Jews happened. I mean, can you imagine being held inside a city for 4 years with no supplies coming in? They were dying of thirst and starvation. You can almost feel the misery that was about to come upon those people as I read Jesus's words from the Weymouth translation in Mark 13, verses 18 through 20. "But pray that it may not come in the winter, for those will be times of suffering, the like of which has never been from the first creation of God's world until now, and assuredly never will be again. But for the fact that the Lord has cut short those days, no one would escape. But for the sake of his own people, whom he has chosen for himself, he has cut short the days." Pretty strong language, don't you think, Rob?
Oh, it is strong language. Now, but there is something we need to consider. He said this would be the greatest tribulation ever, but did he really mean that literally? I mean, one could argue that it was the greatest and worst when you read the account of what we've already spoken of, Josephus said in the Wars of the Jews. But this type of expression is commonly referred to as hyperbolic or apocalyptic language, and we're going to expand on that in a few more verses. But continuing on, it says here in verse 21 through 23, "And then if anyone says to you, 'Look, here is the Christ,' or 'Look, there he is,' do not believe it, for false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform signs and wonders to lead you astray, if possible, the elect. But be on your guard. I have told you all these things beforehand." Mark 13, 21 through 23. So if this is the time frame of the first century, then, Julie, we must ask, Were the false prophets and false Christs in those days following this?
Well, yeah, there were false Christs and prophets. It's well documented by Josephus in the War of the Jews, which, again, we'll get to later on. But first, notice the extreme emphasis Jesus put on the next verses. Mark 13, 24 through 25. But in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Is that to be taken literally? Was the sun to be literally darkened? The moon not literally to give its light? Would the stars literally fall from the heavens? And were the powers of heaven literally to be shaken? My answer to these questions are a resounding no. And I know yours is too, Rob. But how can we say this with so much certainty?
Well, that is a good question, and we need to address this because, after all, this is one of the reasons why everyone is still saying that this has not happened. But we can be sure that this wasn't to be taken literally because we have precedent in the Old Testament for such a thing. Listen to what commentator Albert Barnes says about this in his commentary written over 150 years ago. Commenting on Matthew's exact account of this, he says, the images used here are not to be taken literally. They are often employed by the sacred writers to denote any great calamities, as the darkening of the sun and the moon and the falling of the stars, would be inexpressible calamity. So any great catastrophe, any overturning of kingdoms or cities or dethroning of kings and princes is represented by the darkening of the sun and moon and by some terrible convulsions in the elements. And we have to realize that after Barnes stated this, he shows proof of it, doesn't he, Julie?
Yeah, he does, Rob. He does that by pointing out the pattern in the Old Testament, because this same hyperbolic language was used by Isaiah. Notice that as I read from Isaiah 13, the first verse, the oracle concerning Babylon, which Isaiah, the son of Amoz, saw. Okay, that's verse 1. It tells us the calamity concerned ancient Babylon. So notice what Isaiah states in verse 10. For the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light. Sounds familiar.
Yes, it
And
does.
continuing in verse 13, he states, therefore, I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will be shaken out of its place, and the wrath of the Lord of hosts in the day of his fierce anger. Was that all literal? I don't think we'd be here if it were. But there's more examples than just that one, aren't there, Rob?
Yeah, there's several more examples in the Old Testament. We see the same type of language used in the judgment against Tyre in Isaiah 24:23. We see the slaughter in Bosra and Idumea is predicted the same language, the same way in Isaiah 34:4. And there are several Old Testament passages, which I'm displaying on the screen right now, in Isaiah 50, Isaiah 60, Ezekiel 32, and Joel 3. And I'd like to point out that each of these prophecies came about exactly as foretold. And there was no celestial catastrophe that happened at that time. The language which was used here is commonly referred to, as we said, as hyperbolic or apocalyptic language and contains extreme verbiage in order to make that point. We all do this at all times. For example, we might go outside in the summertime and say, wow, it's like a furnace out here. Don't we, Julie? We do these.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you're right. Let's fry our eggs on the sidewalk.
Yeah.
We exaggerate. Yeah. We exaggerate all the time just, to make a point. And our culture, understands it just as their culture understood it. So if you take Mark 13:24 literally, which says that the stars will be falling from the heavens, we know it had to be exaggerated language because the stars are way bigger than the earth and they're so far away that our gravity has no effect on them anyway. And it was no different with the prophecy in Isaiah 13 concerning Babylon. So we got to understand that this was merely a common way of expressing judgment upon a nation or nations, and it was frequently used in the Old Testament. So that sets the precedent.
Yeah, and we've kind of beat this thing to death, this point to death for a reason. In Mark 13, we have Jesus using the same type of language to describe the destruction of Jerusalem as it occurred in AD 70. The apostles understood this and were used to hearing this type of verbiage. So, Julie, what can we look forward to in our next segment?
Well, Rob, when we come back next week, we're going to examine the rest of what Jesus said in Mark chapter 13. And we'll also continue to establish how we can be sure that this was not a reference to some future cataclysmic worldwide event, which sadly too many Christians today have been misled to wait for. But viewers, I hope you're glad you tuned in today. So thank you. And please remember to like and subscribe to this channel. It really does help us if you do that. So anything more, Rob?
Yeah, well, Julie, you're right. It's going to be an exciting segment because we're going to discuss his coming in the clouds with power and great glory. Very powerful and revealing. So, as always, I'm going to close this by saying the same thing I do in just about every video. May God's grace be with you always and have a great day. And Julie?
Same thing. Keep yourself in God's love. Bye-bye.
Amen. Have a great day.